Hey YouTube, Mr. Terry back once again to watch another history video. Got some good feedback from the last couple episodes of Oversimplified's World War II episode. And the biggest, I guess, request I got was to continue on with that, and specifically with their Cold War episode. So we're going to check this out today and see how it is. I've really liked what the Oversimplified crew has been doing with these videos. They're entertaining, they're fun, and yeah, they're really enjoyable. I think it's a great little just overgloss and to you know, introduce you to these topics or just review them and hopefully go into more research of your own on some of those things. So I'd encourage you to do that. Now, just like I said before, I really would like if you would go to the original video, make sure to give them a like and subscribe, support the content people here. For me, I'm just watching it, giving my feedback. Hope you enjoy that though, but let's go ahead and start the Cold War.
Year is 1917. Fighting rages on the Eastern Front of the First World War. Both Germany and Russia are on the brink of collapse. Soldier, I need you to bring me this
End of World War One.
Got it. Found him, sir. What? No, not Lenin. Lenin, the Russian communist.
Not the Beetle.
Why would I need a beetle? Lenin, the Russian communist. He was exiled to Switzerland. You know what? I'll do it myself.
Capitalism by Karl Marx. Very nice. Yep.
Who wants to start a revolution?
You know, the Germans rolled the dice on a bunch of World War I bets that they were hoping would pan out so they could have success in the war. And for example, a couple of those things. One would be that, you know, the Schlieffen Plan, the plan that they had in World War I to try to avoid a two-front war by attacking the front that would be ready first. Between France and Russia, and they believed that would be France because they thought Russia would take a long time to mobilize. So they attacked France very quickly, and of course did that through Belgium, which gave them a very bad reputation, as Belgium was a neutral country at that time. But the dice roll didn't work because Russia mobilized way quicker than anybody expected in World War I. Okay. Now, another one too they were kind of betting on was the fact that if they had invaded Belgium in World War I, that the British, who are an ally of Belgium, wouldn't, I don't know if care enough is the right word, but it wouldn't be enough to influence them to join the war. But it had the opposite effect too. They were hoping, again, that maybe they wouldn't care as much, or maybe that's not the right word to say, but not enough to actually join the war. Of course, that fails too. And there's a bunch of dice rolls. Again, there's other ones you can look into if you want to talk about it. By dice roll, I just mean something kind of risky, high risk kind of decision that could help them in the war. And one of them that did work out was with Lenin. So Lenin had been kicked out of Russia, and they'll talk about it a bit here. But interesting that they're bringing clear back to World War I for the Cold War. But the idea that getting him funding for a revolution and trying to send him secretly back to Russia to kind of take down Russia from the inside did actually work. So kind of a roll the dice there, and it worked though. And Russia pulled out of the war, which made things much better for the Germans in a way. Even though they lose World War I, that was a beneficial thing to not have to fight Russia at the end of the war.
The Germans put Lenin on a train and sent him all the way back to Russia, hoping he and his mates would create an internal crisis. And create an internal crisis they did. The government was overthrown, and Lenin was in charge. He immediately pulled out of the First World War, made the country communist, started a 3-year-long civil war, got shot, broke the economy, caused a famine, and then he died. On his deathbed he said,
Major
"Hey man,
strokes.
tell whoever's in charge of giving people jobs not to let that jerk Stalin become the next leader." By the way, who did I put in charge of giving people jobs? That would be Stalin, sir. Stalin was a rising force in the Communist Party. He still had some opponents, but conveniently, all of them were arrested or disappeared. So that was lucky. And so Stalin took over. He implemented his 5-year plans, which transformed the country from an agriculture-based economy to an industrial one. And like Lenin before
Russia
him,
was a
he
little bit late
reigned
to
with
industrialize,
terror.
so they
Anyone
get
who
back on the
dared
fast
criticize or oppose him would either be killed or left to rot in the horrendous Soviet work camps. Then a short man with a silly mustache tried to take over the world, punched the Russians all the way to Moscow, and then the Russians, with some help from their faithful ally, the Winter, punched them all the way back to Berlin. At this point, being allies, America, the UK, and the Soviet Union were good chums. They held a couple of conferences near the end of the war to decide what would happen next. Hey Stalin, after all your trials and tribulation, you must be pretty happy to be standing here in Berlin. Tsar Alexander made it all the way to Paris. Just give me a second. Hey man, I think something's up with Stalin. I know, right? What should we do? Shall I tell him about the bomb? Yeah, tell him about the bomb. That will scare him. So, we got this crazy new big A-bomb that can destroy an entire city in one go. Yes, my spies told me already. Oh wait, I meant to act surprised. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, they infiltrated the
He already
Manhattan
knew.
Project.
How? Am I sure I want to send nuclear secrets via unsecure public coffee shop Wi-Fi? Am I ever? Dude, use a VPN. And speaking of VPNs, if,
perfect.
like me, you take internet safety seriously, then you need
I'm gonna let the ad
NordVPN.
run because it's
NordVPN
important that
hides your online
these
activities
people get
from
their
outside
support,
intruders,
so.
preventing anyone from stealing your personal data and stopping your service providers selling your data to advertisers. With over 5,000 servers in 62 countries,
Great segue,
it allows you
though,
to surf the
for
net
just kinda
anonymously
connecting that.
and securely. And it's simple to
'Cause,
use.
yeah, the
With
Russians
just the click
did
of a button, you can connect
manage
to a
to,
server halfway across the world,
infiltrate
even
the
allowing you
Manhattan
to
Project,
access
which
streaming
was the
services from
United
that
States'
specific
supposed
territory.
top secret
Say, for example, you wanted
project
to watch
to
a certain
develop the
oversimplified
atomic
video that
bomb,
for
but
some reason has been
the
blocked in your
Russians
country.
are
With
going to get theirs about
NordVPN, you can. It
4
works
years later. The
seamlessly
Americans
across
got their
PC,
first test in
mobile,
July
and tablet.
1949.
Go to
Or sorry, 45, and then the Russians
nordvpn.com/oversimplified
got
to get an
their
amazing
bomb
75% off.
and
That's
did their
just
first test
$2.99
of it
per
in
month with an
1949.
additional month free for a limited time. So again, that's nordvpn.com/oversimplified, also in the description box down below. Now where were we? Oh yeah. Does the A
Bombs.
stand for atomic or ass? Then America dropped their big A-bomb on Japan, and World War II officially came to an end. Hooray, we won! Okay, so now it's time to establish the New World Order. Stalin, you're in charge of Eastern Europe. Now, we want you to let them all hold elections. Oh yes, of course, elections. And these elections will be free and fair, right? Oh yes, certainly, free and fair. Definitely free and fair. Communist, 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 communist. If that's not free and fair, I don't know what is. Throughout Eastern Europe, Soviet puppet governments were established as a buffer zone between the USSR and the West, with Churchill proclaiming an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. The relationship between the old allies was deteriorating fast.
Now, the Iron Curtain. Okay, let's let the little western border
Descended across
drawn
the
here.
continent.
Okay, so Churchill, right, says that Stalin, the Soviet Union, has created an Iron Curtain. Now, the defense, okay, that Stalin is going to say is basically this. To the question of why are you doing this? Why are you creating this sort of buffer zone? You know what I mean? These are areas that, under the earlier agreements, said that they were going to have free elections and independence and all that, and that didn't happen. And pretty brilliant, I guess, political move, in a way, was Stalin's response to that, which was, well, let's look at recent history. Us, the Russians, right, have been invaded twice now by Western Europe. Okay, by the Germans, of course, in World War I and World War II, right? The aggressive ones that should be feared is not the Russians. It's here, Western Europe. We want to keep the West from invading us again, and I guess in a way to do that is, yeah, we should be able to have this control, I guess, sort of this buffer zone, if you want to look at it that way. So there's a solid point there that Stalin is making, but it, again, made it look very aggressive in the eyes of the West, which was with these takeovers, or with them staying in occupying basically these countries here.
The relationship between the old allies was deteriorating fast. Over the next few years, the British intervened in the Greek Civil War to prevent a communist takeover. In Turkey, the Russians began demanding more control of Turkey's sea access routes, which prompted the US to send their largest battleship to Turkey for a friendly visit. After World War II, Iran was now occupied by both the Soviets and the British, with an agreement to both pull out once the war was over. The British pulled out. Stalin was like, you know what? I think I might stick around. All in favor of kicking Russia out of Iran? You want to know something?
I'm out.
you guys suck. Pressure from the UN forced the Soviets to leave, and with the establishment of NATO, the Soviets had no doubt that the West was out to encircle and destroy them.
Yep.
And America announced the Truman Doctrine, in which they basically said, those guys are not cool, cannot be trusted, and we will do everything we can to prevent the spread of communism around the world. Many view this moment as the official declaration of the Cold War. Back in Europe, everyone was living in a post-apocalyptic void brought on by the Second World War. Cities reduced to rubble, not enough food, it was terrible. This is great. The more they suffered, the more likely it is they'll turn to communism. Dude, you're really messed up. What's wrong with you? My father used to punish me severely. America realized what was going on and quickly made a move. Under the Marshall Plan, they sent $12 billion to Western Europe for its economic recovery. The countries of Stalin's Eastern Bloc looked on with envy. Hey, Czechoslovakia, you want to come get some economic aid? Yeah, but I have to check with my mom first. Sorry, America. I can't come. This was a full-on economic battle raging between capitalism and communism in Europe.
Both sides here. Okay, NATO and the Warsaw Pact is going to call these two military alliances. But specifically, the United States and Soviet Union are basically using Europe here as their guinea pig to show whose system is the better one, right? Because they have very contrasting views, capitalism, communism, etc., and put a lot of effort into that. And so you see, America just pumping incredible amounts of money into the West to start this. And of course, America's benefiting from making trade partners here and that sort of thing. So both sides took it very, very seriously and spent incredible amounts of money in this sort of rebuilding process. And, maybe not as much about actual sympathy towards these people, but more about showing whose way of life, whose system is better to show the world. Because, so you're going to see in the Cold War, it kind of becomes this thing where if you're the United States or Soviet Union, you want the world to decide. You pick a side, right? Our system or, I guess, their system. And so it's like a big recruitment across the planet. Eastern Europe was the big battleground, as the two sides were also physically as close as any place could be on these two sides.
If the Western nations developed faster and better than the East, that would be a defeat for Stalin. So he set up his own rival economic recovery plan, which he called Comecon, and he also set up Cominform, which gave him more political control over the Eastern Bloc. But nowhere did this economic battle rage harder than in the city of Berlin. Caught over 100 miles behind Soviet lines, the city had been divided up between the Allies, and the western segments were still under Western control. East Berliners could travel freely to West Berlin, see the economic prosperity and think, maybe this communism thing ain't so great after all. I'm gonna have fun tonight. You're home late. Oh, Stalin. I was just out with my friends. Friends? You stink of capitalism! You're out engaging in imperialist debauchery again! I swear, Ivan, I can't keep doing this. Stalin wanted the West out, so he said, hey, guess what? I'm blockading all of your supply routes to West Berlin. What are you gonna do about it? I suppose we'll just fly the supplies in.
Berlin airlift, yeah, look it up.
Alright, Truman. You win this round. The Berlin airlift was an incredible undertaking and a major success for the Western Allies, and Stalin ended his blockade of West Berlin. His aggressive actions worried the West, but not as much as this did. The Soviet Union had developed their very own atomic bomb. The USA no longer had a nuclear monopoly. The world now knew that if a major war broke out between the two superpowers, it would be more destructive than anyone could imagine. So it was comforting when Stalin came out and said that war between the Soviet Union and the West was unlikely. Oh, wait, inevitable. He said it was inevitable. Hey, you know who I haven't checked in on in a while? My good friend China. Whoa, what happened to you? What happened to them was a full-blown civil war that had been going on since 1927. The People's Liberation Army, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, successfully defeated the Republic of China, who fled to Taiwan. The now communist China and the Soviet...
Now, this civil war has been going on forever. Ever since World War I ended, China, their Communist Party started to grow, right, under Mao Zedong. And in the pre-World War II years of the Civil War, the Kuomintang, or the nationalist government, had been successful. They were successful. Look into the Long March as a very important part of the history of communism in China. But things were not going well for the communists. And to be honest, the best thing that happened almost to the communists in China was World War II. The two sides had to put aside their differences to unify against Japan when they invaded China in World War II. And during those years too, and during the hardships, I think, of World War II, a lot of more and more people started turning to communism by the time to the Communist Party. And then when the war was over, and the Civil War resumed, which is exactly what happened, the sides had kind of flipped, and eventually leading to a communist victory by the Communist Party, and driving out the Chinese government to the island of Taiwan down here. And yeah, China has now entered, a phase of communism as the new order here in China. Now, that, as you can imagine, that was very, very scary to the West, because you have the largest populated country in the world has now turned to communism, and a potential alliance between China and Russia could be a devastating one in the eyes of the West. So this was kind of scary times, and it looks like communism is kind of winning here, especially in Asia. So here in the 50s, it was a great concern to the West of what had now happened here in China, and the potential of what the future could look like.
The Soviet Union signed a mutual defense treaty. This was terrible news for the West. But wait, there's more. After the Second World War, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. In the north, the Soviets set up a communist regime. In the south, America set up an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Korea under their own regime. Now that he had the bomb, Stalin was feeling a little more cocky, and he finally gave Kim permission to attack. The North launched a surprise invasion of the South on June 25, 1950. With Soviet aid, the North Koreans steamrolled through, taking Seoul in just 3 days and replacing one ruthless dictator with another. The UN were freaking out and quickly created an emergency force made up of troops from 16 countries to defend the South. The West still held Busan and made landings at Incheon near Seoul. They pushed the North Koreans out of Seoul, replacing the ruthless dictator that had replaced the first ruthless dictator with the same ruthless dictator that had previously been replaced by the new ruthless dictator. And the West then continued all the way up the Korean Peninsula. At this point, China was getting worried that the UN may just keep going. The US had sent this guy to lead the operation. After winning the Pacific theater of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur's head was big, and his balls were bigger. He reassured President Truman that there was absolutely no way at all that the Chinese would ever get involved. Meanwhile, 500,000 Chinese troops were crossing into Korea. Nuke 'em. No. Nuke 'em. No. Oh, come on. You're fired. The U.S. considered the nuclear.
This was a very interesting moment here because MacArthur had kind of become this war hero after the success of World War II. And with this spread of communism and all that, and how, communism, of course, had been marketed in the West as this, evil sort of thing. And having had used, atomic weapons, before, MacArthur was one that said, no, why are we stopping? You know what I mean? And proposed using it again, using atomic weapons again. And Truman was having none of that, so he got fired. And it kind of interesting what happened with the American public is a lot of people still supported MacArthur, and there was people that were against him, calling him this like violent warmonger and all this stuff. So it was an interesting time of how it kind of split a lot of American opinion at this time. But it is a very interesting to think about, what if during like the Korean War atomic weapons were used either on North Korea or China? Would that have brought in the Russians? Are you looking at World War III here, which again has not been very long since World War II ended, but a very interesting alternate reality that could have happened, and a very devastating one at that.
The Soviets also had the bomb. They didn't want to risk all-out global destruction. The communists pushed the West right back almost to the exact same spot they had all started from, and they ended up in a stalemate, where they remained until both sides finally agreed to work towards a peace settlement in 2018. Back in America, Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected famed World War II General Eisenhower, who was really hard to draw. It's 1953. Hey Stalin, how you doing? Oh, he's dead. He had a cerebral hemorrhage, and his reign of terror kinda came back to bite him in the ass, because he had imprisoned all of his best doctors, and those that were left were too terrified to treat him. The new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, called a meeting and said, "Hey guys, you know how Stalin was imprisoning and murdering us all for doing basically nothing? Yeah, he was kind of a jerk. I'm really not sure how this is news to you." Khrushchev went on a campaign of Desalinization. Statues of Stalin were taken down, Stalingrad was renamed, and Khrushchev announced that he wanted the Soviet people to be happy and would allow greater freedom in the Soviet Union.
Now don't think that Nikita Khrushchev is like an anti-communist. He's a hardcore communist for sure, but definitely believed that the brutality of Stalin and just the oversight of everything, and their such strict control and all those sort of things, that needs to be lightened up a bit. So they call it, Desalinization, but don't misunderstand that he is looking to end communism or anything like that there. But I mean, really, if you are replacing Stalin, I mean, almost anybody that replaces Stalin is going to look a lot more of a lighter touch ruler. I mean, it's hard to top Stalin in that way. So, but let's remember that with Khrushchev, and it's you're going to see the Khrushchev years are some of the actually the years of the most heightened tensions of the Cold War, as I'm sure they're going to start talking about here.
Union. So how did that work out? Well, an uprising in East Germany was brutally suppressed, a revolution in Hungary was brutally suppressed, and demonstrations in Poland were brutally suppressed, although he did finally allow some mild reforms. Back in the Soviet Union, he permitted more cultural expression, but then began banning stuff based on his own personal taste. Modern art looks like a child urinated on a canvas. Banned. Jazz music sounds like the feeling of needing to fart. Banned. Your poetry is really depressing. How could anyone in the Soviet Union be depressed? You're banned. Khrushchev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but not like that. Or that. Or that. Young people began enjoying abhorrent Western pop culture. Son, remove that disgusting imperialist apparel at once. Shut up, Dad. You can't tell me what to do. Well, would you look at that? Turns out he can tell me what to do. The West had initially liked the cut of Khrushchev's jib, but world events soon soured relations even more. The two sides were spying on each other a whole lot throughout the Cold War. The KGB had spies and informants in nearly every aspect of Western life and government, so much so that whenever the US tried to send spies into the Soviet Union, the KGB were usually ready to arrest them on the spot. Members of the Manhattan Project aided the Soviet Union in acquiring the bomb. Some American officials believed they were on the wrong side. I'll sell you 3 secrets for $5 million. Okay. Go ahead. The Allies are digging a tunnel under East Berlin to tap your communications. There's an American agent living at this address in Moscow, and sometimes, when I'm home alone, I like to put on my wife's dresses, sit in the corner, and cry for hours. Very interesting. In America, fear took hold during the Red Scare and the Mccarthy trials. American values imploded as fear of communism collided with freedom of thought and expression, and communist kind of became a buzzword thrown around to describe anything people didn't like. Hollywood? Communist. Your next door neighbor's dog? Communist. When the grocery store cashier asks if you need a bag when you clearly can't carry 10 tubs of Baconaise in your hands, communist. But one area in particular where the US had an edge over the Soviet Union was in its espionage technology.
So Joseph McCarthy, senator in the United States, was famous for approaching Congress and the public, basically saying that there is a deep communist infiltration in the major institutions in America. And he had claimed that he had this list, of people that were there, and people ask him, like, can we see the list and all this, and it never really happened. But the fear still took place, even without maybe a lot of the direct evidence. And so during these years, the Red Scare, as it's also called, was a rough time if you were anybody that showed any kind of sympathy in any way towards communism, even if you didn't, because just getting labeled that communist was could ruin you. You know what I mean? And yeah, you could go and report somebody, like, I don't know, you don't like your neighbor down the street and you're sick of them. All you got to do is go down to the authorities and say, hey, I think this guy is a communist or a spy. You better believe someone's going to show up to their doorstep, some people in suits, and interrogate things. But yeah, a lot of people definitely bought into it, that there was this deep communist infiltration into major American institutions, which kind of fueled even more of the anxiety here in these early Cold War years.
In particular, U-2 spy planes flew across Russia carrying out surveillance from the skies. There was a nasty incident in 1960 though, when one was shot down and Khrushchev was furious. Who the hell is this? He's a high-altitude weather enthusiast who flew off course.
Right.
Okay, that sounds plausible. Wait a minute. Why does he have a gun and a poison needle? Because he's a very naughty high-altitude weather enthusiast. But much to America's concern, the Soviet Union appeared to be ahead in the space race. Everyone freaked out when Russia launched the world's first satellite, and then they actually sent a man into space. Even worse, there also appeared to be a missile gap in the Soviets' favor, and Khrushchev was so confident that he even allowed the US to set up a technology exhibit in Moscow, attended by a certain Vice President Richard Nixon. Check this out. We have color TV. Yes, but we've been to space and can obliterate you with our massive nuclear arsenal. check out this vegetable peeler. Tensions increased further when both sides upgraded their atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs. And after West Germany was allowed to join NATO in 1955, Khrushchev set up the Defensive Warsaw Pact, strengthening the military ties between the Soviet Union and its satellite states. In 1960, Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected John F. Kennedy. The Soviet Union was advancing its technology, but it was also bleeding its coffers dry, and all of the money was going towards the military, not the people. Life under communism was...
Yeah, the Cold War it costs an absurd amount of money, because not only are you doing this military buildup and the crazy price of trying to developing atomic weapons is staggering to the economies of these two countries. And although you might think here at the end of the 50s, early 60s, that if there's someone winning the Cold War, it would be the Russians, right? They now have a bigger arsenal of weapons. They have basically achieved all the major milestones of the space race. First to put, Sputnik was the first satellite put into space. They were the first to put a person into space, a dog into space. I mean, every major checkpoint here, or what's the word? You know what I mean? It'll come back to me, but is being won by the Soviet Union here. So, but at a great cost. As you can see, what they just ended with before I paused here, the Soviet economy is struggling to keep up with all this spending, but at the same time trying to run an economically successful nation, and it's kind of bankrupting their nation in a way. And the people, of course, are the ones that are going to be feeling it. So, how long can this actually go on? We'll see. By the way, sorry if you're hearing some weird background noise. That would be my dog here, who apparently doesn't think I'm giving him enough attention. So don't mind that. It's not part of the video, but don't worry. He's fine.
Still as hard as ever, and Berlin remained a thorn in the Soviet side. The contrast between the economically prosperous West and the struggling East was clearer day by day, and East Berliners were still able to freely travel to the West. Now, many of them were deciding to stay there. Millions defected to West Germany via West Berlin, causing Eastern factories to lose workers and taking a heavy toll on the economy.
It was pretty
Soviet
obvious
leaders decided this couldn't continue any longer.
Than the
First,
communist
Khrushchev
side.
tried this: leave West Berlin, or else. Or else what? Or else I'll be really mad at you. Yeah, no, we're gonna stay. Listen, man, West Berlin is ours, East Berlin is yours. That's just how it is. Kennedy felt pretty good about his show of American resolve. But wait a second, did you catch that? Let's replay it.
East Berlin is yours.
Uh-oh, Kennedy just told Khrushchev that the USA wouldn't interfere in what the Soviets did with their section of Berlin, so Khrushchev came up with a new idea. We're gonna build a wall, and it's gonna be a big, beautiful wall, and it's gonna keep out all the Mexicans. No, that's wrong, it's gonna keep in these Berliners. Oh, sorry, it's gonna keep in all the Mexicans. On August 13th, 1961, Berliners woke up to find their city divided into two, with barbed wire and guards blocking the border between East and West. Over time, a wall was constructed throughout the city. Families were torn apart. Thousands would risk their lives escaping over the wall, and hundreds would die trying. To the despair of Berliners, the West were unable to do anything about it, but the wall did put on full display the failure of the communist system. As Kennedy said, democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. As part of the agreement between...
Similar to the Iron Curtain criticism, the Soviets are going to use a similar defense for why is this happening. Defense, right? They're afraid of, whether it's being invaded or something like this, because they're not going to come out and publicly state that this wall is actually to keep people in, which is the bigger effect of this wall, because, yeah, it was true that for years and years and years, many people from East Berlin had been moving to the western side, where growth was happening much, much faster under kind of the American guidance over here. And they're losing people, not just losing everyday people. They're losing from east to west very important people. We're talking very educated, learned people. And losing those people, I'm sure, was very, very harmful to East Berlin. So this wall, although again you can state that it's for a defense thing, like they're saying here, was probably most effective for keeping people in from being able to move into the west part of Berlin.
between the two sides, US diplomats were still allowed to travel to East Berlin. But suddenly, East Berlin crossing guards started giving them the business, and Kennedy was like, nah-uh. In October, the US rolled tanks up to the crossing point at Checkpoint Charlie as a show of strength. The Soviets did the same, and the two were in a standoff. They stayed like that for 16 hours, and the world braced for nuclear Armageddon. Thankfully, though, Kennedy called Khrushchev directly and was like, hey man, this is getting way too hot. How about you back your tanks up by an inch and we'll do the same? Sounds good. Okay, how about you back your tanks up by another inch and we'll follow suit? Alright, hey, you want to do another inch? And they both very slowly inched away from the apocalypse.
Yeah, one of those
let's hope that's the biggest crisis
handful of
on my
moments
presidency.
where we got about as close as possible to a nuclear war. Okay, so things are definitely, they're getting heated here. Again, you're seeing a couple of the incidences where we are getting very, very close, potentially, that could potentially make it to a war. And it's so much pressure has now been put on these two individuals, Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy, of having to deal with this. And it's a very serious moment here. So anyway, great first part here so far. I'll definitely do a reaction to the part 2, but yeah, I'm really enjoying it so far. Good stuff in here. So many things, of course, I could comment about, and I don't want it to turn into that completely, but a lot of things to, if you're again into this, to look more into. Cold War is such a fascinating part of history because you know, just the world has completely changed since World War II, and at the base of all of this, the ability to utterly destroy places, right? And potentially the world is something the world had never had to deal with before. So the Cold War, thankfully, was a Cold War, right? Meaning it didn't heat up directly between the two, but I'm also, you know, as you saw here, there was plenty of fighting, right? Proxy wars. The couple of the big ones here, of course, was first big one with the Korean War, which again could have turned out even worse than it was, and already is such a devastating war. But in the future, you're going to get the Vietnam War and these sort of things. So anyway, we'll check that out when we get to that with part 2. So stay tuned for that when it comes out. Now, once again, make sure you support the original creators by going to their site or their page and liking and subscribing. Definitely do that here if you want to see more of these videos. As always, if you have video suggestions, leave them in the comments. I love hearing anything that you have to say. So hopefully, again, we see more of you. Please come back again, and we'll see you next time.